This morning to the 14th Annual Ecological Integration Symposium. We have a great lineup of speakers today, and I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Kevin Hines, Assistant Provost of Graduate Studies and former head of the Entomology Department, to give our introductory remarks. Thank you.
Well, I know everyone here from Texas A&M will know this, but for some guests, we start most things here with a big howdy. Howdy. Great job. So I am Kevin Hines. I'm the Assistant Provost for Graduate Studies and bring you greetings from the Office of Graduate Studies and Dr. Karen Butler-Perry, who's the Associate Provost. Again, welcome to the 14th Ecological Integration Symposium. And there's just a few little points I'm going to bring in kind of my introductory remarks and quickly get off the stage so your five excellent speakers can take over. But I think the first thing is kind of to acknowledge that this is really kind of a celebration of a community of scholars in the sense that one of the real highlights, I think, of this symposium, it's really a student-driven process. So I remember as a department head meeting with the students as they were coming asking for funds and whatnot, but it's student-driven in the sense of concept and how it's organized, and obviously you'll see students up here on the stage running it. After today, of course, it's dominated by a series of student presentations, both by the graduate students and undergraduates, and covering a wide variety of topics, both in ecology, evolutionary biology, and conservation biology. While the audience is a little sparse right this minute, in 15 minutes, I'm sure the room will be filled. After all, introductory comments are just what they are. But it usually brings in about 500 people from the local community, from all kinds of different departments across campus. And so a really good integration of thought processes and disciplines as well. Something that some of you may recognize is that this is also the culmination of the Student Research Week. And the Student Research Week is a long activity of the types of a platform showcasing really what our students here at Texas A&M do in terms of research, both at the undergraduate and graduate level. Also, just within that context is a few little things to kind of note about Texas A&M University if you haven't known them already. So very impressive if you've tried to find parking on this campus. It has 50,000 students. 10,000 of those are graduate students. So while you'll hear a lot of whoops and hollers and things about undergraduate things, a full 20% of them are graduate students pursuing a wide variety of degrees. And also at the university, we really do over about $7 million of externally funded research per year, which kind of fits into this Student Research Week. And it has the Texas A&M University ranked third among all public universities in this category. I think it'd be remiss if I also didn't kind of comment or at least acknowledge the growth of the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology group with an interdisciplinary research program that has faculty from over 10 different departments and 4 different colleges. So again, quite a diverse array of individuals supporting this type of activity. So I think the last point I want to make is that every student, you'll hear this often in the context of a student-run organization and student presentations, that all students are award winners. And in the context that I know you're giving out awards at the end of tomorrow. But I think there's something else to note, that many of the students that will be standing up here truly are already award winners. Whether they received awards when they were recruited into Texas A&M, whether it be a diversity fellowship or a merit fellowship, or that the excellence that they've done in teaching, research, and service, whether they are a Phil Graham Scholar or Distinguished Graduate Student Scholar, or one of the other many awards that we give, that many of the people that will be standing up here truly are the best of Texas A&M University. So I'm going to get out of the way because I know you have a cast of 5 different invited speakers that, at least in the way I looked at it, really covered a breadth of things from urban ecology to conservation biology to some really kind of theoretical types of views on ecology, which I think will set a great platform for discussion and debate and camaraderie, especially I think at the session you have tonight, which will probably have a few refreshments at them as well. So again, my comments will be will end right now in giving those greetings. I hope you have an excellent meeting, and gig 'em.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Margot Wood, and I have the privilege of introducing our first plenary speaker, Dr. Thomas Brooks. Dr. Brooks received his BA in Geography from the University of Cambridge and his PhD in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology from the University of Tennessee. Dr. Brooks is currently the head of Science and Knowledge at the IUCN in Gland, Switzerland, and IUCN is the International Union for Conservation of Nature. He previously worked for the Nature Conservancy and the Center of Advanced Spatial Technologies, at Conservation International as the Vice President, and at NatureServe as Vice President of Science and Chief Scientist. Dr. Brooks is an accomplished scientist, authoring approximately 200 scientific and popular articles, including 22 articles in Science and Nature. He's been a member of the IUCN Red List Committee since 2001, a member of the Steering Committee of Species Survival Commission since 2004, and a chair of the Biodiversity and Protected Areas since 2009. Dr. Brooks focuses his research on threatened species conservation and biodiversity hotspots, and he has a particular focus on avian conservation and hotspots within tropical regions of the world. Dr. Brooks has more than 20 years of experience in biodiversity conservation research. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Thomas Brooks.
Thanks so much, Margot. So, howdy. It's an enormous honor to have the chance to talk to this 14th Ecological Integration Symposium here in Texas A&M University. Thank you so much to the organizing committee for the very generous invitation and your patience with my complicated logistics. It's also a great pleasure to have the chance to come here. I've had friends and colleagues and collaborators here in Texas A&M for many years, but haven't had a chance to visit yet. So wonderful to be here. I'm going to address two questions today. The first is, what is happening to the diversity of life on our planet? What are the trends in biodiversity around the world? And the second is, what are the impacts of the conservation actions which human societies undertake around the world on changing those trends? What are the impacts of conservation on biodiversity trends? Now, when you start thinking about trends in biodiversity, it's quite easy for a rather grim picture to emerge, as shown here in this gloom and doom scenario being presented to those poor first graders there. This is a cartoon from the Danish cartoonist duo Wolf Morgenthaler, and that sort of grim picture can rapidly get picked up in policy making and decision making as well, as shown there with the G8 nations saying that their three species are plenty strategy is unanimously approved. What I'm going to argue, though, is that this kind of grim view of trends in biodiversity is at least partially based on misinterpretation, maybe even willful misinterpretation, and failure to appropriately account for the impacts of conservation actions and to consider what would have happened in the absence of conservation actions. Now, there are two trends which have emerged quite strongly around the world over the last 10 years or so, which have really given impetus towards attention to monitoring of biodiversity and monitoring of conservation. The first of these is the emergence of explicit time-bound targets in policy. Policy across all different levels of organization, state level, country level, and even through to the international level. And so from the perspective of biodiversity conservation, the highest profile example here is that of the strategic plan for the Convention on Biological Diversity, which comprises 20 explicit time-bound targets for the time period 2011 to 2020 of the desired state of biodiversity and progress of conservation over this decade. This current decade is the International Decade of Biodiversity, as declared by the UN. And these kind of explicit policy targets drive a serious demand for monitoring. If we're going to be able to apply, to take seriously explicit policy targets, then we have to be able to report against them. The second major driver behind growing attention to monitoring of biodiversity and conservation has been coming more from the bottom-up level, more from the practical level, rather than from top-down policies, and this and driven in particular from advances in conservation science, drawing from traditions in disciplines like medicine and engineering, to better demand evidence of impact, to better allow for progressive learning and adaptive management in the practice of conservation. And so, for instance, there are now a number of initiatives focusing on looking at the evidence for conservation impacts. There are now journals established focusing specifically on conservation evidence and conservation impact, and a number of international standards emerging around these. So two trends pushing us towards better understanding trends in biodiversity and trends in conservation, one coming top-down from policy and the other bottom-up from science and practice. In my talk today, I'm going to focus in from this very broad spectrum, the full remit of biodiversity conservation, to look at two specific aspects of conservation as reflected in two of the Convention on Biological Diversity's 20 actually targets. Target 11, which focuses on protected areas and specifically sets an explicit target of coverage of 17% of the land area and 10% of the oceans, in particular focusing on areas of particular importance to biodiversity over the coming decade. And then a second target, which I'll give particular attention to, related to the species level of ecological organization, calling for, again, setting a global target to stop extinctions of species, or to reduce extinctions to the background rate over the coming decade. And to reverse trends in species declines and push declining species onto a recovery track by 2020. The tools and the data which I'll draw from and base most of the work which I'll present today on come from a set of knowledge products organized through IUCN as the World Conservation Union. Just as an aside here, I have to say that I find the term knowledge products rather technocratic and boring, and And happily, the New Zealand conservation anthropologist Aroha Mead suggested just a few weeks ago that a far better term for knowledge products can be drawn from Maori legend, the term of Ngā Kiti Aranui, which means baskets of knowledge for the good of humanity. And so I'll be opening 3 of these baskets of knowledge, standards and data and processes and products to analyze trends in biodiversity and conservation. To understand the role of IUCN in mobilizing these knowledge baskets, it's important to say a few words about the structure of IUCN as the World's Conservation Union. IUCN comprises 3 distinct components, 3 threads of the rather creatively termed triple helix. The first of which are members. So IUCN is not a government organization, it's not an NGO, it's a membership organization with the membership of the Union comprising 200 governments and government agencies from around the world. So, for example, here in the US, 5 government agencies are members of IUCN. And then also about 1,000 civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations. So this platform of both public and non-governmental organizations provides the legitimacy for these kinds of standards of biodiversity knowledge, and also the first step in their application on the ground in policy and practice in government and NGOs. The second strand of IUCN is the professional staff distributed across about 45 countries, and the staff of IUCN provide the glue, provide the organization necessary to maintain these kinds of very large data systems and products. And finally, and actually most important in the structure of IUCN as regards mobilizing biodiversity and conservation knowledge, is the fact that the Union convenes 6 specialist commissions comprising about 10,000 independent scientists from around the world, including a number from here in Texas A&M, and it's the individual level of membership of IUCN through the commissions, which provides and maintains the data necessary to inform these kind of knowledge products, and ensures its rigor and independence. Let's have a quick introduction to the knowledge products, to the data sets which are going to form the backbone of the questions that I pose on monitoring biodiversity and conservation. The first of these is the Red List of Threatened Species, a global tool for assessment of extinction risk at the species level. Now, the IUCN Red List is the oldest and the best known of the IUCN knowledge products. It first emerged in the early 1960s, so it has more than half a century of history behind it now. It's maintained not just by IUCN but also by a dozen or so Red List partner organizations, of which Texas A&M is one of those 12 or so organizations around the world who support the Red List of Threatened Species. It has gone through some quite dramatic change over the last 20 years or so. In particular, I think there are three three major changes which have taken place through the structure of the IUCN Red List, which are worth really highlighting because they have major implications for how the data can be used, which will bring us to the theme of the talk. So first of all, and really most fundamentally, the IUCN Red List has gone from being a system largely driven by specialist opinion, the opinions of the world's preeminent specialists in conservation and extinction, but opinions nonetheless, to being one which is organized according to quantitative standards, quantitative categories and criteria, and quantitative thresholds to ensure transparency and, critically, repeatability of the assessment of extinction risk. The challenge, the problem faced by specialist opinion approaches to conservation was actually highlighted as early as 1984 at the Road to Extinction conference, and that in turn led to intensive work over the coming years to develop draft categories and criteria for the assessment of extinction risk, drawing from underlying ecological theory, published in 1991 by Georgina Mason and Russ Landy. And then that in turn went forward into a decade-long period of review and revision, resulting in approval and publication of the Red List categories and criteria, the Red List standards, in 2001. So nearly 20 years of process there to develop these kind of standards. As you can see, IUCN doesn't necessarily move extremely fast, but the benefit accrued by that more deliberate process and progress is one of legitimacy. These standards are approved by that full membership of IUCN, 1,000 NGOs and 200 governments as representatives of the conservation community. The second major change, which has played out through the application of the Red List categories and criteria over the last decade or so, has been a shift from assessment of extinction risk to hand-picked species, as it were, to species thought in advance to face high extinction risk, and a move instead towards assessment of risk of extinction across entire higher taxonomic or ecological groups of species. And actually, even more recently, that sort of comprehensive approach, looking at all mammal species, all bird species, and so on, has also been supplemented by the development of some sampling approaches to apply the Red List categories and criteria to a sample of megadiverse taxa, to allow insight into status and trends for less well-known and highly diverse species groups, in particular invertebrates. With that kind of comprehensive or sampled application of the Red List categories and criteria, it then becomes possible to draw inference about the state of biodiversity beyond individual species. And so this graph here, for example, shows threat prevalence across a number of major species groups. You can see that rates of threat indicated by the red and orange and yellow sections of those bars vary quite dramatically across different groups of species, with some groups having quite low threat rates, about 1 in 10 bird species and odonata species, dragonfly and damselfly species are threatened, with a high probability of extinction, all the way through to groups like cycads, a highly endemic ancient plant group, which have extremely high threat prevalence. More than half of the world's cycad species stand to be lost in the medium-term future in the absence of conservation action. Finally, the third major change, which has been implemented through the IUCN Red List, is that it's no longer just a list. The term Red List is actually singularly inappropriate. It's now the required and recommended documentation accompanying the assessment of species extinction risk is now quite extensive and incorporates the application of standard classification schemes for things like species habitat, so providing a link between species and ecosystem levels of risk of loss, standard classification schemes for different kinds of threats and different conservation actions underway or recommended, and also standard geographic and spatial data. In particular, through distribution maps. All of those associated data allow much more power in subsequent analysis and application, and also much more insight into recommended conservation responses. This greatly increases the utility of the Red List as a conservation tool. Let me move on to say a couple of words about a second knowledge product, which I'll draw from quite heavily this morning, and this is the Protected Planet product, which draws from the World Database on Protected Areas. Now, it's worth saying a word about what actually a protected area is before going further here. The IUCN's World Commission on Protected Areas is the preeminent global body concerned with supporting and maintaining protected areas as a conservation tool. And the World Database on Protected Areas is actually formally mandated by the United Nations for the world's governments and sub-national jurisdictions to submit official data on the extent of protected area, the extent of the conservation estate of land and water use. The World Commission on Protected Areas clarified a couple of years ago, clarified the definition of a protected area shown in the top right there. And there are two particularly important points, two important characteristics of that definition that are worth emphasizing. One is that protected areas in the sense of the World Database on Protected Areas can have multiple objectives, multiple purposes. Clearly, there are many protected areas established for cultural reasons or historical reasons and so on. But for incorporation here, their primary purpose is the conservation of biodiversity. The primary objective of protected areas is nature conservation. The other important point about that definition is actually something that it omits, which is actually highly significant, and that is that definition is silent as to the governance of a given protected area, the governance type of a given protected area. So what this does is to open the interpretation of land or water set aside for conservation to a very broad suite of different institutional arrangements, all the way from traditional views of centralized government-led national parks and other reserves, all the way through to a whole suite of maybe less traditional approaches to safeguarding nature in land and water, through local community efforts, efforts from the private sector, indigenous communities, and so on. So protected areas focused on biodiversity conservation, but silent on governance type. Here's the current output from the World Database on protected areas, getting on for 200,000 sites identified and managed for the conservation of nature around the world. A couple of characteristics there. One is that the global extent of protected area coverage is now more than 13% of the land area, and so at least in terms of terrestrial of the terrestrial realm, protected areas are now one of the dominant land uses on our planet. That's rather less the case in the marine environment, although, as you can see, there have been some very large marine protected areas established as well. So these data on the extent and coverage of protected areas will form a key part of the analyses which I'll present. And then a final data set, a final knowledge product, which will form an important part of this presentation, is the standards for the identification of sites which contribute significantly to the persistence of biodiversity. These are broadly termed key biodiversity areas. Approaches to identification of important sites for biodiversity also date back several decades. The earliest approaches were put in place, for example, through the natural heritage programs here in the US almost 40 years ago, and through BirdLife International and their partner institutions, through identification of important bird areas, sites of significance for the persistence of avian biodiversity, also starting in the early 1980s. Through the last couple of decades, these sorts of approaches have proliferated and been applied very widely, in fact, by other institutions, and considering other components of biological diversity. Some of them have been taxonomic, so for example the work of Plant Life International in identifying important plant areas, and others of them have been more ecologically focused, so for example looking at important sites for freshwater biodiversity. Over the last 10 years or so, IUCN and specifically the World Commission on Protected Areas and Species Survival Commission have been convening a process to develop an umbrella of standards and criteria around all of these existing approaches to the identification of important sites, to allow a presentation of a common data set, a common knowledge product through this proliferation of different individual taxon or biome ecologically specific approaches. In this presentation, I'll talk about two subsets of that overall umbrella of key biodiversity areas. One of them taxonomically focused and one of them thematically focused, but both of them critically globally comprehensive, and so allowing comparison between different places on the planet. The first is the important bird area work, which I mentioned a minute or two ago. That is the identification and location of sites of global significance for the persistence of bird biodiversity. These sites are triggered by, again, application of thresholds for significance of populations present of highly threatened bird species, of bird species with geographically restricted ranges, bird species which congregate or aggregate at particular points in their life cycle. So, for example, migratory stopovers, so catching a dimension of ecological process. And finally, bird species assemblages characteristic of intact ecosystems, so capturing a dimension of ecological integrity. About 10,000 sites have been, important bird areas have been identified around the world through consistent application of these criteria and thresholds by organizations within each of the world's countries. Here's a quick example of a couple of important bird areas. So to give you a sense of the kind of thing we're talking about here, this is this is actually the island of Cebu in the central Philippines, where I've had the privilege to do some work. The bird up on the top right there is a Cebu flowerpecker, Diceum quadricolor, which has a global distribution. Restricted to two small forest patches in central Cebu. One of them government managed, the other of them managed by the local community. So those two sites, those two forests, trigger the criteria for identification of important bird areas through their presence of the threshold populations of Cebu flowerpecker, and also actually of a number of other bird species which are either threatened or highly restricted within the central Philippines. The second key biodiversity area data set, which I'll draw from here, is that convened by the Alliance for Zero Extinction, a partnership of about 80 international and national non-governmental conservation organizations dedicated to identifying and safeguarding sites around the world which have the entire global population of at least one highly threatened species only found in that individual site. So this is you could see this, if you like, as the tip of the iceberg of key biodiversity areas of important sites. These are sites where there are no options, there's no redundancy at all in the distribution of species. If that site is lost, then the entire species will become extinct. And these, as I say, this mechanism is a cross-taxonomic one. It's been applied comprehensively across all bird species, mammal species, amphibian species, a number of reptile and plant and coral species. The Alliance for Zero Extinction identify about 900 species around the world which meet this criterion, and occur in about 600 sites. So a number of those sites have more than one highly threatened species wholly restricted to them. Again, the key point here is one of comparability. Each of these taxonomic groups which inform the application of this standard have been comprehensively assessed globally, so it's possible to compare what's going on in one part of the world to another part of the world and to compare over time. Here's an example of an Alliance for Zero Extinction site, again somewhere where I've been lucky enough to work in southeast Kenya here. The Taita Hills between the famous Tsavo East and West national parks in southeast Kenya are an isolated, tiny mountain range, which hold the entire global populations of a number of highly threatened species, bird species, amphibian species, and plant species. Okay, so with that background in hand on the global knowledge products for extinction risk, the red list, for protected areas, the World Database on Protected Areas, and for important sites, the Key Biodiversity Areas Standard, let's now move to look at trends in biodiversity over the last 4 decades or so. As I say, all of these standards have been in place for 30 or 40 years now, and so are able to inform biodiversity monitoring and the development of indicators. The first of these that we'll look at is the Red List Index, to provide information on changing aggregate extinction risk over time. The Red List Index is derived by stacking together the genuine changes in extinction risk which have occurred through particular species groups over a particular time period. It's calibrated such that if all species in a given group have a low risk of extinction, then the Red List Index would equal 1. And if all species in that given group are extinct, if there's not a single one left on the planet, then the Red List Index would equal 0. Obviously, the x-axis there is time, and so faster downward slopes here indicate a more rapid slide towards extinction of species in a given group. This is the Red List Index for bird species over the last few decades, and shows that in aggregate there have been a small, it's still significant actually, but only a small increase in slide towards extinction of the world's bird species. This combines not just changes in extinction risk resulting from increases in extinction risk, but also those resulting from decreases in extinction risk, which is a point to which we'll return. For amphibians, the picture is rather more grim here. You can see that the positions of the Red List Index on the y-axis there are much lower. So amphibians as a group face a much higher level of threat already. And then the line is steeper. The rate of decline over the last few decades has been much faster for amphibian species than it has for bird species. For mammals, we find trends in between those two extremes staked by birds and mammals, both in terms of position on the y-axis, how threatened the group is, and in terms of how steep the line is, how fast the group is sliding towards extinction in aggregate. And then maybe most terrifyingly, we find for coral species extremely rapid increases in aggregate extinction risk over the last decade or so. A product both of locally driven threats to and impacts on coral reef ecosystems, and of the emerging damage driven through climate change and ocean acidification. So the overall picture from looking at the Red List Index, looking at change in extinction risk across entire species groups, is one of persistent declines, and one of declines which vary quite widely in their characteristics between different taxonomic groups and different environments. Let's have a look at change over time in protected area coverage. So this is clearly an indicator of conservation. This isn't a biodiversity indicator per se, but an indicator of conservation response. And here, at least on the face of it, we find a rather more rosy picture of persistent increase in protected area coverage over the last 4 decades. The orange portion there shows shows an increase in protected area coverage on land. The blue portion increase on protected area coverage at sea, and the light blue and light yellow components respectively reflect uncertainty around those figures, because there are a number of the data in the World Database on Protected Areas don't incorporate accurate dates of establishment, which obviously introduces uncertainty into the trends. So the overall picture here is one of strong increases in protected area extent over the last 4 decades. What's that doing in terms of coverage of biodiversity? We know biodiversity is distributed very unevenly around the planet's surface. How well are those increases in protected area coverage reflected in coverage of important sites for biodiversity? And we can have a look at this by simple overlay of two of the knowledge products which we discussed earlier. Overlay of the World Database on Protected Areas with the key biodiversity areas data sets. Are places where people are managing for conservation landing in the right places, and places that are particularly important for biodiversity. And if we look at both the geographic coverage of important bird areas and Alliance for Zero Extinction sites on the left, and of the changes in time, changes over the last 4 decades in that coverage, we can again see increases in the coverage of important sites by protected areas, to the point now where about a third of key biodiversity areas, both the bird-specific important bird areas and the highly threatened Alliance for Zero Extinction sites, are now represented, are now covered in some form of protected area. However, if we look at those increases in a proportionate sense rather than an absolute sense, the picture is rather less rosy, because what's been happening is that the rate at which important sites are being safeguarded through the establishment of protected areas is slower than the rate of protected area establishment overall. And so the establishment of protected areas is disproportionately focusing on places that are less important for biodiversity. There could be a number of reasons for that. The most obvious ones being that land use conflicts and conflicts in different kind of economic activities are less severe in those less important places. And so for both important bird areas at the top there, and for Alliance for Zero Extinction sites, we actually see decreases in proportionate coverage over time. So the emerging message from those views, both into the Red List of Threatened Species, into protected area coverage of important sites, are ones that show, thinking back to that opening slide, that show fairly grim pictures, that show pictures of continuing slide towards biodiversity loss, and conservation responses that don't appear to be targeting the right places. However, this I think is a rather narrow and misleading view of indicators of biodiversity and conservation. In particular, what I'll spend the rest of the talk arguing is that it is really important to consider not just what the overall trend is in progress with conservation of biodiversity, but also what would have happened in the absence of conservation actions. This is application of counterfactual techniques to ask not just what is the overall picture of what's happening, but also what would have happened in the absence of intervention. And again, these kind of techniques very well established in many other disciplines, but only recently begun to be uptaken into biodiversity conservation science. So let's first of all have a look at the application of counterfactuals to think about changes in overall extinction risk. And as I say, as I mentioned earlier, the Red List Index is reflective of genuine changes in extinction risk across the species in a given group over a particular time period. Those changes can be in both directions, both negative ones as species become more and more threatened with extinction, but also positive ones as species become less threatened. And so the lines shown by the red list indices there for birds, mammals, and amphibians are the aggregate of those positive and negative changes. What we can do, thanks to the application of the conservation actions classification scheme that I talked about earlier, is to separate out those changes which are being driven by conservation action, most of which are positive changes, reductions in extinction risk. And if we take those positive changes out, we find, shown by the red lines here, that extinction risk across birds and mammals would have increased substantially more over the last 2 or 3 decades than it has in effect because of our conservation, because of humanity's conservation actions. Those red lines there are about a fifth again, about 20% again, closer towards extinction. The aggregate slide of bird and mammal species around the world towards extinction would have been about 1/5 again faster in the absence of conservation actions. You can also see in the bottom right there that the picture for amphibians doesn't have that positive story. Conservation actions are still lagging well behind for amphibian species, and those that are up and running have not yet been able to slow the decline of amphibian species towards extinction. So these red list indices reflect aggregate changes in extinction risk, driven not just by increasing threats, but also by the sum total of conservation actions implemented that affect birds, mammals, and amphibians. Let's now move to have a look at the impacts and results of a specific kind of conservation actions, that of the establishment of protected areas. Now, for about a decade now, there's been growing attention to application of these new kinds of counterfactual techniques to tease apart the impacts of the establishment of protected areas from what would likely have happened to biodiversity in the absence of the establishment of those management tools. Maybe the first major piece of work looking at this more than 10 years ago now was from Brunner et al. in Science, and showing really surprisingly substantial benefits of protected area establishment at the ecosystem level. This was specifically in tropical forest ecosystems across about 100 parks around the world, and looking at rates of vegetation loss before the establishment of the park compared to the present day, and showing that the majority, I think 80% or so, of tropical forest protected areas were reducing and turning around the rates of vegetation loss. So biodiversity at the ecosystem level in this case. More recently, some much more sophisticated both data and techniques have been applied to this question of protected area effectiveness at the ecosystem level, using remotely sensed data and using matching pairs counterfactual techniques, and showing that that when looked at through the lens of appropriate counterfactuals, in particular because many protected areas are established in biased locations, places that are difficult to access or places that are far from roads. If you compare, if your null model, if you like, compares rates of decline in those environmental characteristics represented within protected areas, then the benefit to reducing ecosystem conversion is shown to be rather lower. But nevertheless, it's still a positive benefit. The Ander et al. Work there showing benefits of a little less than 10% reduction in habitat loss when appropriate counterfactuals are applied. More recently, there's been just the beginning of approaches to look at these questions at the species and population level. This was some work published a couple of years ago looking at trends for large mammal species populations in African protected areas. The aggregate pictures there break down in quite different ways geographically, is one important point to see there, with quite rapid declines of large mammal species in protected areas in East and Western Africa, but persistence or even increases in Southern African protected areas. It's important to highlight, though, that this work focused on a smaller subset of biodiversity, just on large mammal species, and indeed those species for which population level data at a high enough spatial resolution of individual protected areas are available. And those sorts of pictures persist even when looking at the application of counterfactual techniques. This was some work from Kenya a couple of years ago, looking at population trends in large mammals, not just inside protected areas, but also in similar environmental space outside of protected areas, and showing that the rates of decline were as fast inside as they were outside of protected areas. So the evidence for these small subsets of large mammal species is that protected areas are not delivering very effective biodiversity benefits at the species level. What we'll do here, this is the last analysis that I'll show, is to put together the three big data sets, the three big knowledge products. So the Red List Index, looking at trends in aggregate extinction risk over time. The World Database on Protected Areas, Protected Planet, highlighting the locations of areas of land and water devoted to conservation management, and the data from the application of the important bird areas and Alliance for Zero Extinction key biodiversity area standards for identification of sites contributing to the global persistence of biodiversity. And by putting together those three data sets on changing extinction risk, changing protected area coverage, and high resolution site location occurrence of biodiversity, we can ask whether species occurrence in protected areas tends towards reducing the rate at which those species groups are sliding towards extinction. Are species which are well protected across their ranges, well protected across the places where they occur in very many protected areas, do they tend to be sliding towards extinction more slowly than those which are not occurring widely in protected areas and species which are largely unprotected? So for important bird areas, this separates those bird species for which more than half of the important bird areas where they occur are covered by or represented in protected areas from those species with less than half of their important sites under protection of some kind or another. And shows a rather dramatic result there, which is that through application of this kind of appropriate counterfactual, we find that the rate at which bird species are sliding towards extinction when they are well represented in protected areas is half that of those species which are poorly represented in protected areas. So protected area coverage doesn't completely take away extinction risk. It doesn't provide a magic bullet which solves all conservation problems. But it has a dramatic impact in reducing the slide towards extinction. The status of the world's bird species would be much worse in the absence of protected areas than it is today with the coverage of 3,500 of those bird species triggering important bird areas with their extensive representation in the world's, in the protected area networks of the countries of the world. And we see a similar picture for Alliance for Zero Extinction sites as well. The contrast here is much more cut and dried, as I explained earlier. Species triggering the identification of Alliance for Zero Extinction sites by definition occur only in one place. And so the contrast is simply between sites that are wholly represented, wholly covered by protected areas, relative to those that are outside of the protected area network or just touch onto the edge of protected areas. And here you can see again that the rate at which Alliance for Zero Extinction species, highly threatened species which only occur at one site around the whole world, the rate at which their extinction risk has been increasing, the rate at which they've been sliding towards extinction, is halved through the establishment of protected areas of various kinds in those sites. Just to wrap up with three, what I see as three major challenges facing these lines of work. One is in the comprehensiveness and resolution of these kinds of techniques. In terms of comprehensiveness, I've presented data and analyses for terrestrial vertebrate species, which clearly, while they're some of the best known and best loved components of biodiversity, are a very long way from representing biodiversity as a whole. And so better developing techniques, probably largely sampled techniques for reflecting plant and fungi and insect invertebrate biodiversity in biodiversity indicators is a high priority. The Barometer of Life campaign, which E.O. Wilson and others launched in Science a couple of years ago, sets a challenge for representative sampling of measurement of extinction risk across the world's taxonomic groups and ecosystems. The estimated cost of completion of that expansion of assessment of extinction risk is on the order of $60 million over a 10-year period. In terms of spatial resolution, these approaches would also increase the periodicity of reassessment of groups which have already had extinction risk assessed, birds and mammals and amphibians and so on. These techniques will also need to be supplemented with more population-level data. And so, for example, the Living Planet Index of Population Time Series convened by the Zoological Society of London and World Wildlife Fund will be important in adding spatial resolution to these kind of broader geographic trends. I've just talked about two components of biodiversity and conservation monitoring, looking at protected area coverage and looking at species extinction. But clearly the scope of biodiversity conservation is and must be much broader than those specific components. Indeed, the biodiversity targets, as I say, span 20 explicit targets across the scope of biodiversity and conservation, including measures of the pressures on biodiversity, measures of increasing ocean acidification or conversion of natural ecosystems, climate change. Measures of the state of biodiversity along the lines of the Red List Index, which we discussed. Measures of conservation responses, and again, the protected area data which I've presented are an example. And measures, importantly, also measures of the benefits of biodiversity and biodiversity conservation accrued to humanity in the form of ecosystem services and natural capital and cultural value. There's work underway towards developing indicators for each of these themes and each of these targets. But for many of them, data remain very sparse and geographically biased and low temporal resolution. But finally, and I think really the key take-home message here is one actually of the glass half full. What we see through application of appropriate counterfactual techniques is that conservation actions are working, are greatly reducing the loss of biodiversity to that which we would face in the absence of those interventions. But we also see that we're a long way from what is necessary to stop, to prevent biodiversity loss, to take that rate of decline all the way up to zero and ideally into the positive with restoration and reintroduction. Some very neat work in Science last year looked at the cost of not just maintaining existing investments, that those existing conservation actions which we've been discussing, but also of comprehensive implementation to meet the ACHI targets, specifically here in the case of protected areas and preventing extinction. And showed that, and this is work specifically for bird species, showed that for species-specific conservation, on the order of a doubling of budgets across the world's conservation agencies and organizations will be necessary. The bars on the left show existing investment, bars on the right show required investment. And in particular, expansion of protected areas across different kinds of governance to currently unprotected sites will require major additional investment on the order of $50 billion or more. Of course, these kind of numbers sound large, especially in the context of the current global economy. But relative to investment in most other sectors of society around the world, this is a tiny amount of money. So yeah, just to wrap up with summarizing the two high-level themes there. global knowledge products exist that allow insight into monitoring biodiversity over the last few decades around the planet. If we look at state alone, we see persistent declines, but if we look at conservation actions and in particular apply appropriate counterfactual techniques to ask what would have happened in the absence of conservation, we see significant benefits being accrued by conservation actions already. We just need much more of those actions in order to safeguard biodiversity. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brooks. I think we have time for around 1 or 2 questions.
Whoever has a question, just raise your hand. We'll flag you down.
So in terms of freshwater and estuarine biodiversity, protection of land doesn't do much good if we continue to divert freshwater for human uses, which is a big pattern we're seeing in this part of the world and many other parts of the world. How do we deal with that?
So yeah, I'll agree. Actually, some of us were talking last night about the fact that the state of freshwater biodiversity and rates of decline in freshwater biodiversity and the implications that those have for human uses may actually be some of the most challenging problems across the whole of conservation. I actually think that there may be some quite important benefits even of terrestrial protected areas to freshwater biodiversity, in particular through reduction of siltation and pollution, obviously depending on the exact topography and where in the world that's going on. And so I wouldn't underestimate the benefits of terrestrial protected areas, but at the same time, I guess my overall sense is that for maintaining freshwater biodiversity, landscape level approaches will be particularly important to supplement site level conservation approaches to move towards integrated watershed management and whole system maintenance.
So as species are lost globally and are taken off the red list, are we seeing that part of that change in the slope or rate of decline is also related to just more resistant species? Are we losing the species that are most?
Good question. So there's a red list category for extinct, and so species which have become extinct are retained within that calculation, such that if, for example, all of the world's mammal species became extinct, then the red list index for the world mammals would go all the way down to 0. The data, but your point about the potential for bias in these kind of indices is a really important one, and one that has kind of plagued application of techniques for measuring change in aggregate extinction risk over the years. There was an influential paper in Nature in 1993 which made a kind of first attempt at doing this, which failed to separate out changing knowledge from changing state. And obviously, actually, most of the changes that are reflected in the red list are driven by changes in knowledge. So it's only when you have that coded across 60,000 species in the red list such that you can separate out changing knowledge that the remaining pattern, the remaining indicator, is one of genuine change. So bias is clearly extremely important to avoid here.
So let's once again welcome thank Dr. Brooks for his talk.